The black expanse of space stretched endlessly, a cold, indifferent void, beneath the colossal bulk of the Imperial fleet. Earth's most advanced sensors barely registered their arrival, the enormous ships looming like silent titans in the distance. On board the flagship, Dominion's Wrath, Admiral Caspian Trask gazed at the blue orb below, his face unreadable. In the sterile command room, a subtle vibration underfoot was the only sign of the ship's vast power, thrumming like the pulse of a living thing. "We could level their cities in hours," Trask muttered, his voice sharp as the metal walls around him. "They are nothing more than an experiment in futility." A cluster of officers stood at attention, the air thick with the scent of sterilized metal and cooling circuits. One officer, standing at the rear, hesitated before speaking. "Admiral, you mean to say they're primitive weaponry?" His tone dripped with mockery. Trask's lips curled into a smile as he turned to face the officer. "Primitive? Hardly worth the mention," he said, his voice carrying over the faint murmurs of distant commands. "Their resistance will be brief, yet educational." He turned back to the viewport. The Earth, small and unimportant, floated beneath the Dominion's Wrath, a planet brimming with fragile life forms whose technology hadn't advanced in millennia. Earth's last line of defense, an outdated series of tanks and ballistic missiles, was nothing compared to the might of the Imperial forces. A fleet of massive assault walkers, their plasma shields glowing faintly, and drones capable of rendering entire cities to rubble, were more than enough to crush the resistance. Trask's fingers brushed the edge of his uniform as a soft chime interrupted his thoughts. The tactical officer, a man with a stony expression, turned from his station. "Sir, we've identified key military installations on Earth. Shall we commence with the bombardment?" Trask paused. His sharp gaze swept over the planet below. "No," he replied coolly. "Not yet. Let them believe they have a chance. I want them to feel their futile struggle before we end it." Across the room, an officer smirked. "Admiral, shall we send them an ultimatum? A surrender or perish message?" Trask's gaze locked onto the officer. "No need. Let them try their feeble tactics. We'll give them a lesson in real warfare." The plan was simple, almost laughably so. Send a few of their best soldiers to crush Earth's defenses, stage a brief skirmish, then announce their inevitable victory. Trask turned to face the star-filled expanse again, barely noticing the soldiers in the background moving with practiced efficiency. His mind was already calculating how quickly Earth's infrastructure would burn under the heat of Imperial fire. But as he stood there, looking down at the fragile world, a small, almost imperceptible part of him wondered, could this be more than just an easy conquest? Could Earth's defenders have something they hadn't yet anticipated? The door slid open quietly, and Major Ethan Hayes entered, his boots clicking sharply against the metallic floor. His posture was straight, confident, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something Trask couldn't quite place. "Admiral," Hayes said, his voice calm and deliberate, "we've started preparing our defensive positions. I recommend focusing on key tactical zones. They won't expect that." Trask didn't respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on Earth. "Tactical zones?" he echoed, as if savoring the irony. "You think they stand a chance?" Hayes met his gaze evenly. "They're not giving up without a fight, Admiral." Trask chuckled, a sound laced with disbelief. "Very well, let them fight. The lesson will be enlightening." The Dominion's Wrath loomed overhead like a silent predator, its massive shape cutting through the black void. As the weight of the impending assault settled in, Major Ethan Hayes stood on the concrete floor of the command center, his eyes scanning the holographic map laid out before him. The image of Earth glowed, a swirling ball of blues and greens, its surface dotted with flashing red indicators. Targeted cities, military sites, defense installations. It seemed so fragile, so easy to conquer. Yet Hayes remained still, his mind racing, trying to piece together the pieces of a strategy that could tilt the odds in their favor. "Commanders," Hayes said, his voice steady but carrying a certain urgency, "we need to think beyond the obvious. They expect us to try and fight them with brute force, just like any other planet they've crushed. We need a different approach." The room was filled with murmurs, a mixture of skepticism and nervous energy. The walls, adorned with sparse tech, pulsed with the occasional flicker of a faulty light. The stale scent of recycled air filled the space, blending with the subtle but pervasive tang of metal and sweat from the soldiers crowding around the map. Hayes wasn't sure if it was just the atmosphere of uncertainty or if the pressure of the looming invasion was taking its toll on the men and women gathered in the room, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. His fingers traced the contours of a mountain range on the map, outlining a natural fortress of rocky ridges and tight valleys. "We use the terrain to our advantage," Hayes continued, ignoring the skeptical glances from some of the officers. "The Empire's massive walkers are built for open battlefields. They're unwieldy and narrow, obstructed terrain. If we hit them in their weak spots, if we push them into tight corners, we can force them to fight on our terms." "Fighting on our terms?" A voice from the back of the room cut through, a slight quiver of disbelief in it. "They have walkers that can crush anything in their path. What's a mountain range going to do against that?" Hayes turned sharply, his gaze locking onto the officer who spoke. His eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "We don't need to match them in strength. We need to outsmart them. Every piece of equipment they have is powerful, but it's designed to fight a certain way. We don't fight them head-on. We hit them where they least expect it. The enemy underestimates our ingenuity." His hand slammed down on the table with a resonating crack. "We'll use their arrogance against them." He scanned the room once more. "Gather the troops. It's time to make them see the true power of human will." The officers around him exchanged uncertain looks but nodded, some with more conviction than others. Hayes stood tall, his boots echoing as he stepped forward. The smell of burning coffee lingered in the corner of the room, the sharp scent cutting through the stale air. His mind was already racing through the possibilities, mentally mapping out the defensive positions, coordinating with the tech teams who were working tirelessly to modify the M1 Abrams tanks for their most crucial role yet. There was no room for mistakes. Earth's survival hinged on this, on their ability to take the impossible and turn it into something that would give them a fighting chance. As Hayes walked out of the room, the sounds of footsteps and voices drifted behind him. The outside air felt colder as he stepped onto the base's outer deck, the sharp bite of wind rushing against his face. He looked up, the coldness of space above mingling with the warmth of the bustling human hive beneath. His pulse quickened. The Empire would come for them, no question. But Earth was not a planet that would roll over. Not this time. Not on his watch. The ground trembled beneath the weight of the incoming Imperial forces, their shadows stretching over Earth's surface like a foreboding storm. The Dominion's wrath hung in the heavens, a hulking reminder of their invaders' strength. Hayes stood on the edge of a desolate training ground, the wind biting through his jacket, carrying the faint scent of dust and burnt oil. His fingers clenched around the rough fabric of his coat, the anticipation gnawing at him. The moment of reckoning was near. As the Empire's ships began descending from orbit, their colossal shapes blocking out the weak sun, Earth's defenses stirred. The M1 Abrams tanks rolled out of their bunkers, engines growling as their powerful tracks crunched over the dirt. They were ancient in design, relics of a bygone era, yet Hayes knew they held the key to their survival. He had seen the modifications, the reinforced armor, the new targeting systems, the EMP shielding that hummed faintly through the circuitry. These were not the same tanks that had once patrolled the barren fields of Earth. These were tools of defiance, forged in desperation. "Here they come," muttered Sergeant Brooks, his eyes fixed on the sky. The looming shape of a massive walker, its plasma cannons glowing ominously, appeared on the horizon. The soldiers around Hayes stood tall, their faces hardened by the knowledge of what was about to unfold. The air was thick with the scent of burnt fuel, the tang of sweat, and the metallic sharpness of tension. "They don't know what they're in for," Hayes said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. Every soldier in that line believed in him. He couldn't afford to let them down. The first salvo fired. Plasma bolts streaked across the sky, crashing into the earth with a violent explosion. The shockwave hit them like a wall, throwing dust and debris into the air. Hayes gritted his teeth, the stinging particles of dust scratching at his skin, but his focus never wavered. The tanks rumbled into position, their barrels swiveling with deadly precision. The ground beneath them buckled as the walkers advanced, their towering frames casting long shadows over the battlefield. Hayes took a deep breath, smelling the faint tang of gunpowder mixing with the cold bite of the wind. His heart pounded in his chest. The walkers were monstrous, their legs moving with a mechanical precision that made the earth seem insignificant beneath them. But this wasn't their battlefield. This was Earth's soil, and here they had the advantage of knowledge. "Target the joints," Hayes ordered sharply, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hit them where they're weakest." The M1 Abrams tanks responded in unison, their cannons firing in rapid succession. Each shot rang out like a thunderclap, striking the walkers with a force that made the ground shudder. The air was alive with the sound of fire, explosions, crackling plasma, the shrieking of metal under pressure. A walker staggered under the force of a direct hit, its knee joint buckling as it collapsed with an earth-shaking thud. The soldiers cheered, a brief but welcome moment of triumph. But the Empire wasn't finished yet. The remaining walkers fired back, their plasma shields flaring as they retaliated. Hayes watched as one of his men, a young private named Larson, fired a round that missed its mark. He heard the unmistakable whoosh of a plasma bolt and turned just in time to see Larson's tank erupt in flames. The air smelled of burning metal as Hayes' stomach churned. He clenched his fists, biting back the urge to scream. He knew the stakes, knew how many lives depended on the success of this battle. He took a step forward, his boots crunching in the dirt as he steadied himself. "We're not done yet," he growled, his voice hoarse but unwavering. The tanks continued to fire, the ground trembling beneath them, as they fought back against the overwhelming might of the Empire. The battle raged on, an endless clash of titans, with Earth's defenders holding their ground, barely. Above, the Imperial ships loomed larger, their dark silhouettes casting an ominous shadow. Hayes knew the first victory was fleeting, but it was a victory nonetheless. The Empire had underestimated them, and for the first time, they were starting to realize just how dangerous humanity could be. The aftermath of the skirmish hung in the air, thick with the stench of burning wreckage and the acrid taste of sweat, still fresh on Hayes' tongue. The battlefield, once a symbol of strength and arrogance for the Empire, was now marked by the twisted remains of their assault walkers and the charred remains of his comrades' tanks. Hayes stood amidst the carnage, his eyes scanning the field, the weight of their first victory pressing heavily on him. It had been a costly one, and though they had struck a blow, he knew the Empire would not relent. Their first taste of resistance was only the beginning. His boots crunched over the gravel as he approached his team, who were already setting up in a temporary command post. The air here was thick, sticky with the taste of battle. His fingers slid over the rough surface of the map, eyes tracing the contours of the newly drawn tactical grid. The faint echoes of comms crackled in the background, orders being relayed, coordinates being shifted. His body ached with exhaustion, but there was no time for rest. The next phase had already begun, and he needed to find a way to exploit the Empire's weaknesses before they could regroup. "We've got a window," Hayes said, his voice cutting through the low murmurs of the room. He studied the map, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the Empire's patterns. The Imperial walkers had suffered damage, but their shields had held for the most part. That was where they needed to strike, direct fire at their joints, their vulnerable points. The walkers' joints are their weakest points. We can exploit the damage we've already done. "We're not going to be able to just walk up and hit them there," Sergeant Rojas said, his voice tinged with doubt. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered with the years of fighting in countless skirmishes, but even he could sense the magnitude of the challenge ahead. "I know," Hayes replied sharply, his eyes locked onto the tactical map. "We need to be smarter than that. We don't have the firepower to just go toe-to-toe with them." His finger hovered over a ridge to the east, outlining a narrow pass between rocky outcroppings. "We lure them into this position. If we can force them into these narrow spaces, their mobility will be limited. They won't be able to use their firepower to full effect." The officers around him exchanged uneasy glances. Rojas spoke again, this time with less certainty. But if they push us into the open, we'll be sitting ducks. They won't push us, Hayes said, more to himself than anyone else. We control the ground. We make them come to us. His voice was quiet but filled with the weight of conviction. The air in the room felt heavier now, the tension palpable as the plan began to form, half-formed yet dangerous in its promise. Outside, the sounds of distant explosions echoed across the battlefield, a constant reminder of the threat still looming. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of burning rubber and scorched metal clung to the back of Hayes's throat. His mind raced, piecing together the strategy, but it was like fitting together pieces of a puzzle with missing parts. They had the advantage, but for how long? The comms crackled again, bringing him back to the moment. "Sir," came the voice of Private Danvers, "the Empire's reinforcements are nearing." Hayes looked up, his expression hardening. The moment of surprise had passed. The real fight was just beginning, and he had no illusions about the scale of what lay ahead. Then let's give them a fight they won't forget. He turned back to the map, his hand steady, even as his heart raced in his chest. The plan was set. The stakes were higher than ever, but they had something the Empire didn't, the element of surprise and the will to fight. The Empire thought they could crush humanity easily. Hayes was determined to show them how wrong they were. The ground shook as the Empire's reinforcements descended. Massive walkers and assault ships cutting through the morning air like harbingers of doom. Hayes's pulse quickened, his hands gripping the edges of the map as the sharp scent of sweat and metal filled the command post. The dust in the air clung to his skin, gritty and heavy, mixing with the sharp tang of fuel burning from the nearby tank engines. The hum of the battlefield was inescapable, a deafening roar that threatened to drown out his thoughts. "Hold steady," Hayes muttered under his breath, almost as if to reassure himself. He'd seen the size of the enemy forces. A dozen colossal walkers, their plasma cannons aimed directly at the heart of Earth's defenses. Thousands of soldiers, their mechanized exosuits glinting ominously under the rising sun, advanced in perfect unison, a show of military precision that made the Earth forces seem like ants beneath their feet. The Imperial commanders had clearly underestimated Earth's ability to adapt. The Empire's arrogance, though, would be their undoing. Hayes felt the weight of their doubts pushing against his resolve. They believed their walkers could march through anything, crush anything in their path, but they had never encountered the human capacity for improvisation. "Major, we've got a problem," Sergeant Rojas' voice cut through the tension. "We've lost contact with the northern unit. They're not responding." Hayes' brow furrowed as he pulled up the satellite feed. The northern defense line, once a solid block of tanks and infantry, was now a crumbling mess of fire and smoke. The Empire's new wave of walkers had blasted through their defenses with brutal efficiency. His stomach tightened. "How long until they reach the trap?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "We've got minutes, maybe less," Rojas answered, his voice laced with anxiety. "At this rate, the walkers will break through before we can spring it." Hayes knew time was running out. The plan had to work, or Earth's last defense would collapse. The tanks, already stationed at the southern ridge, could still pivot to the narrow pass where the walkers would be forced into a bottleneck, but the window was closing. He could almost taste the tension in the air, thick and palpable. The faint scent of smoke from the northern front mingled with the sharp, bitter tang of fear that lingered in the command room. "Move the units now," Hayes ordered, his voice carrying a weight that brooked no argument. The plan had always hinged on timing, on precision. If they could guide the Empire's forces into the narrow pass where their numbers would count for nothing, they might still have a chance. The tanks rolled forward, their engines thrumming beneath them as they moved into position, the earth vibrating with each heavy tread. Hayes could feel the hairs on his neck prickle, the anticipation rising with every passing second. The Empire's walkers, slow but powerful, were drawing closer. Hayes stood tall, barely noticing the dust that coated his face. He was all too aware of how fragile the moment was. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the explosion, for the moment everything would either fall into place or shatter. The Empire's force was colossal, its confidence unshaken, but they were about to realize how wrong they had been about Earth's resolve. "Prepare for impact," Hayes said, his voice low and steady. "They'll never see this coming." His eyes locked onto the approaching walkers, the sweat on his forehead blending with the dust, as the first explosion from their side cracked the stillness. The Empire's advance was a machine, a relentless, unstoppable force. But humanity? Humanity was something else. Something they didn't expect. With one final, breathless moment, the trap was set. And Hayes? Hayes was ready to make the Empire regret ever underestimating Earth. The rumble of Earth's ground defenses blended into the air, a constant backdrop to the approaching chaos. The tanks were in position, the narrow pass now waiting to swallow the Empire's invincible force. Hayes stood at the front of the command post, his breath slow but steady, his body tense as if every muscle was on the edge of breaking. The sky above seemed to darken with the weight of the Empire's approach, the air thick with the dust of 100 battles that had yet to be fought. "Now," Hayes whispered to himself, as the first of the Imperial walkers came into view, their colossal forms darkening the horizon like something out of a nightmare. The battlefield felt impossibly still for a moment, as though the universe itself was waiting, holding its breath. The Empire's forces moved in perfect unison, the sound of their massive strides shaking the earth beneath them. It was impossible to ignore the sheer terror they invoked, but Hayes wasn't afraid. He was ready. "Ready your shots!" Hayes barked, his voice sharp as a whip. His soldiers moved like clockwork, each tank swiveling into position with practiced precision. The metallic tang of fresh engine oil mixed with the acrid scent of burnt rubber. The air buzzed with the weight of their focus. Hayes felt his pulse rise as the first round fired, the earth-shattering sound of the cannon breaking the stillness. The explosion lit up the battlefield in a burst of blinding light, and the air thickened with the taste of smoke and the sting of dust in their lungs. A walker reeled back, its armor scarred, but the shields held. Hayes's chest tightened. They were still too far from the trap. "They're holding!" shouted Rojas, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got to draw them in." Hayes clenched his jaw, watching the enemy advance, seemingly oblivious to the narrowing space ahead. He felt his teeth grind together as the realization hit. They were too slow. The Empire wasn't going to fall for the trap that easily. They had the numbers. They had the firepower. But Hayes had something they couldn't predict, something they couldn't understand. "Fall back," Hayes commanded, his voice low but full of certainty. The soldiers hesitated for a brief heartbeat, then moved with practiced precision, repositioning the tanks as they pulled back into the narrow pass, hoping to bait the walkers further into their kill zone. The heavy thud of Imperial walkers continued, their plasma cannons lighting up the sky, but now their movements had become more cautious. The trap, once so carefully set, was beginning to close. Sweat slid down Hayes's neck as he adjusted his stance, the metallic taste of tension coating his tongue. They could feel the shift in the air, the movement of something greater, fate, or maybe just sheer will, working in their favor. The sound of gunfire and explosions grew louder, and with each passing second, the Empire's pace slowed. Their overconfidence had started to fray, their movements less certain. Hayes knew they were beginning to question what they had previously assumed. He could almost taste their doubt, thick and heavy, hanging in the charged air. The mystery of humanity's strength, its ability to defy impossible odds, was beginning to haunt their every step. "Get ready," Hayes growled. "When they commit, we'll strike." The air was thick with the promise of the coming fight, the tension like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. The first wave had landed, but the real battle had yet to begin. And as Hayes stood in the shadows, watching the Empire's arrogance begin to crack, he knew this was only the beginning. The true test was yet to come. The weight of the moment hung in the air like the suffocating pressure before a storm, and Hayes could feel every second as it ticked by. The Empire's walkers were now deeper in the pass, their massive forms almost completely surrounded by the craggy landscape. The tanks, camouflaged and hidden in the jagged rocks, were poised, waiting for the command to strike. The space around them smelled of scorched earth and the sharpness of gunpowder. thick with the residue of the explosions that had already ignited the sky. Sweat clung to Hayes's brow, his senses sharp, every nerve primed for what was about to unfold. "Now!" Hayes commanded, his voice a low growl. The first wave of fire erupted from the hidden tanks, a torrent of rounds aimed directly at the vulnerable underbellies of the Imperial walkers. The sound of the cannon's blast cracked the silence, and Hayes' chest vibrated with the sheer force of the recoil. Dust spiraled into the air, the explosive force tearing through the ground, sending vibrations through his boots. The walker at the front staggered, its massive form shuddering under the barrage. For a moment the air hung still, before a second explosion sent it toppling to the ground with a sound like thunder. The earth beneath them trembled again, but this time it wasn't from the Empire's advance, it was from their first real taste of resistance. Hayes stood motionless, watching, his gaze never leaving the battlefield as the smoke began to clear. "Direct hit, sir," Rojas said from behind him, his voice tight but filled with a rare satisfaction. Hayes nodded slowly, but his eyes never wavered. The first kill was just the beginning. The remaining walkers shifted, recalculating, trying to adapt to this unforeseen threat. Hayes could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in the Empire's pace. They were starting to take this seriously. He could see it in the way the walkers moved, more deliberate now, their plasma cannons firing in sporadic bursts. But it was too late. The trap had already been set. "They're off balance," Hayes muttered under his breath. "Keep hitting them. Aim for the joints. Don't let them stabilize." The tanks opened fire again, each shot a sharp, resounding boom that echoed through the valley. The harsh, burnt flavor of the explosion still lingered in Hayes's mouth, mixing with the acrid taste of anticipation. His hands were steady, despite the chaos unfolding before him. The earth beneath him shifted once more as the Empire's forces adapted, drawing closer, but Hayes's plan was already in motion. "Prepare for the next phase," he ordered. His voice, though firm, carried a note of urgency. They had taken the first step, but the battle was far from over. The walkers were powerful, their sheer size overwhelming, and despite the initial victories, Hayes knew this wasn't going to be easy. They couldn't just outgun the Empire. They had to outthink them. The plan had always been about strategy, not force. The Empire, for all its technological might, had one fatal flaw. They underestimated humanity's ability to improvise, to adapt. Hayes could feel that underestimation gnawing at the edges of his mind, pushing him forward. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for humanity's chance to prove that they could face down impossible odds and come out on top. The sound of another plasma bolt ricocheting against a tank hull jerked him back to the present. The walkers were closing in. The real fight had just begun, and Hayes knew it wouldn't be long before the Empire realized just how wrong they had been about Earth's will to fight. The ground vibrated beneath Hayes's boots, each step sending a tremor of urgency through his body as the Empire's forces advanced, undeterred. The smoke from the earlier explosions still hung thick in the air, a grim reminder of the battle already underway. His eyes flickered over the battlefield, scanning the Imperial walkers that now seemed more cautious, more deliberate. They had felt the sting of Earth's resistance and, though not yet beaten, were retreating into calculated formations. The Empire wasn't going to let this fight slip so easily. Hayes could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down on him, each second stretching longer as the enemy reorganized. "Their shields are holding," Rojas observed from behind him, voice sharp with frustration. "Not for long," Hayes muttered, eyes narrowing as the walkers began adjusting their positions, weapons primed and ready to retaliate. "We need to hit them where they're strongest." His fingers twitched at his sides, anticipation building. Their plan was only beginning to unfold, but time was slipping through his fingers, and the air was thick with the scent of anticipation, of steel and sweat. The stillness between the next round of attacks felt almost unbearable. The Empire's walkers paused for a fraction of a moment, as though sensing the shift in the wind. Hayes could feel it too, the palpable change in the atmosphere. They were coming for them. Slowly, surely, but they were coming. "Activate the EMP," Hayes ordered, his voice sharp, sending a ripple of energy through the soldiers around him. They moved quickly, preparing the devices they'd meticulously crafted over the past few days. The air was suddenly filled with the sound of hurried footsteps, clattering gear, the low scrape of metal against stone as soldiers carried out the plan with the quiet intensity of a machine at work. He didn't need to look up. He knew the devices were in place. He could almost feel the charged tension in the atmosphere, the anticipation heavy as the first Imperial walkers began to make their move. The vibrations of their steps reverberated through the ground, each thud a warning, a promise of destruction. The Empire had underestimated the potential of a human army with its back against the wall. They had believed their advanced technology would make quick work of Earth's defenses. Hayes had to make them regret that assumption. He had to make them see that human ingenuity could outmaneuver even the most advanced weapons. "Now," Hayes snapped, his hand steady as the signal to fire the EMP was given. The moment the signal rang out, the pulse rippled across the battlefield like a wave crashing against the shore. There was a brief silence, and then the unmistakable groan of Imperial walkers, faltering under the sudden surge of electromagnetic interference. The sound of their weapons sputtering, the deep hiss of their energy shields failing, echoed across the field. Hayes smiled grimly. The walkers slowed, their imposing figures suddenly vulnerable, as if the very ground had shifted beneath them. The Empire's advance had ground to a halt. The pulse had done its job, but Hayes knew this was only a momentary victory. They had just struck the first blow, but the true battle was yet to unfold. "They're on the defensive," Rojas said, his voice edged with disbelief. "How long can we keep this up?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. His gaze never left the walkers. He could hear the sharp crackle of comms as orders flew through the air, soldiers preparing for the next phase. The taste of dust in the air felt like a warning. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The pulse of the EMP still hung in the air, a tangible wave of energy that had rattled the Empire's precision and steadied Earth's resolve. But as Hayes stood on the ridge, watching the walkers regroup, a new dread crept into the space between his ribs. The Empire wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The thick scent of burning metal and scorched earth still clung to the air, a constant reminder of the fires that had ravaged their forces moments ago. But even as the smoke curled into the sky, Hayes could see the Empire adjusting, their massive walkers beginning to spread out in tighter formations. The deadly rhythm of their movements resumed, slow and deliberate, but now with caution. "Brace for impact," Hayes barked into the comms. The sound of rushing boots filled the air as soldiers scrambled to finalize positions. Every nerve in his body seemed to hum in time with the tension that stretched tighter than a drawn bowstring. The Empire was already preparing for its counterstrike. The earth beneath him vibrated as the walkers advanced again, their towering forms blocking out the sun like great, monstrous statues of destruction. Hayes's pulse quickened, the low growl of tanks revving around him like a chorus of impending fury. The sharp, metallic tang of sweat mingled with the stifling air, thick with the stench of burning rubber, oil, and the promise of violence. "We've only got one shot at this," Hayes muttered, eyes locked onto the walkers' approach. "Take out their shields first." The tanks began firing, the powerful recoil of their cannons sending tremors through the ground. Hayes watched as the first plasma burst shattered into the massive energy shields of the walkers, the shields flaring like the surface of a struck bell. For a moment, nothing happened. The walkers' shields absorbed the blows, each round absorbing into their defense systems, sparking but not breaking. "Damn," Rojas muttered from behind him. "They're holding." Hayes's jaw tightened as he surveyed the situation, each shot now more critical than the last. His fingers brushed against the cool surface of the control pad, calculating. The Empire had adjusted quickly, perhaps faster than he had hoped, but he wasn't ready to throw in the towel yet. He never would be. He turned to the team around him, the soldiers preparing their next moves, their faces set in the same grim expression he wore. The tension was palpable, as if they all held their breath in unison, knowing the importance of every passing moment. The sound of plasma blasts now joined the metallic growls of tanks and the eerie silence between each explosive impact. The moment of action seemed to stretch forever. "Target the joints," Hayes commanded, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "We can't break their shields. We'll hit them where they're weakest." The tanks adjusted their aim with deadly accuracy, their barrels swiveling to target the lower joints of the walkers, just beneath the massive armored plates that had absorbed the fire. The first shot pierced the metal with a satisfying crack, the sound echoing through the valley like a clap of thunder. Another shot, and the same result. Sparks flew, and the walker staggered. "Got one!" Rojas shouted, voice filled with a rare spark of excitement. Hayes nodded grimly, his eyes never leaving the battlefield. They had taken down one, but there were still too many left. The Empire was adjusting its tactics as well. The next wave of attacks came in faster, sharper. The walkers surged forward, plasma cannons firing in rapid succession, tearing up the ground around them. Hayes gritted his teeth as the air around him seemed to crackle with the force of their onslaught. "Keep them distracted," Hayes ordered, his words cold and calculated. "We need time to finish this." As the enemy shifted their formation, Hayes realized they had only begun to understand Earth's strategy. They were adapting too. It was a race now. Who could outthink whom? The stakes had escalated. Each move, each counterattack might be the one that tilted the balance in favor of either side. The weight of it pressed against his chest, the very air feeling denser, filled with anticipation. The battle was far from over, but Hayes could feel the shift in momentum, the first taste of a turning tide, and it sent a thrill through him. This fight was becoming something far more unpredictable, something far more dangerous. The air was thick with smoke, the ground still shaking from the Imperial walkers' heavy steps. The battlefield had become a chaotic tangle of debris and destruction, with the occasional burst of plasma lighting up the sky. Hayes stood at the forefront of his forces, his pulse racing, eyes locked onto the advancing walkers, their movements now more deliberate, more cautious. The Empire had adapted. They were no longer stumbling into traps. They were moving with calculated precision, their responses tighter, more deliberate. "You see that?" Rojas pointed, his finger trembling slightly as the massive walkers reformed, shifting their position with synchronized coordination. "They're starting to split up. They're not just charging head first anymore. They're trying to flank us." "Yeah," Hayes muttered, clenching his jaw as he watched the shifting formation. He knew the Empire wouldn't stop until Earth was crushed under their boot. But he also knew that they had underestimated something fundamental, something that made them predictable. Earth's greatest strength was its adaptability. "They're trying to flank, but they don't realize they're falling right into our hands." Hayes turned quickly, speaking sharply into his comms, his voice cutting through the tension. "Take the East Ridge. Deploy our reserves. Hold them at the choke point. I want a steady fire from the southern tank units. Keep them locked in this corridor." The air seemed to thicken with the weight of his words, the smell of burnt fuel filling his lungs as the soldiers around him scrambled into action. The sound of boots pounding on the dirt and the sharp clicks of weapons being reloaded filled the air. Hayes' own hands were steady as he adjusted the tactical map before him, his fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. Every moment, every decision felt more critical than the last. The Empire had adapted quickly, but they had played right into the trap he'd laid out. Rojas turned toward him, eyes narrowing. "They think they can push through this. They don't know we're waiting for them." "No, they don't," Hayes replied, his voice low and tense. He could feel the hum of anticipation building, the weight of the moment like a storm just before it broke. The walkers, now split into smaller groups, moved with more care, their once immense power no longer quite as threatening. They were still formidable, but Hayes could see the cracks in their armor. As the battle raged, the air around Hayes seemed to tighten, every shot, every explosion more intense than the last. His ears rang with the chaos, plasma bolts tearing through the air, the crack of tanks firing, the metallic clang of walker shields absorbing blasts. But through it all, there was a strange sense of clarity. They were not just holding the line anymore. They were pushing back. A low rumble passed through the earth again, and Hayes felt his heart skip a beat. A new wave of Imperial forces had arrived, massive assault ships descending from above like dark vultures, their weapons primed and ready. The fighters roared overhead, casting sharp shadows across the battlefield, adding a layer of urgency to the unfolding chaos. The Empire wasn't retreating. They were escalating. Hayes had hoped for a moment of reprieve, but now he could taste the gravity of the next challenge in the back of his throat, like a bitter aftertaste. "Hold the line," Hayes commanded, his voice firm, a line drawn in the sand. "We can't let them advance. Not one step further." The weight of his words hung in the air. The battle was far from over, but Hayes had a fleeting sense of something new, a shifting tide, a sense that Earth's forces were finally beginning to understand the full extent of what they were capable of. The true fight had only just begun, and it would be a fight for survival. But for the first time, the Empire was on the defensive. The weight of the moment pressed down on Hayes as the Empire's reinforcements arrived, their monstrous forms descending from the heavens like the inevitable shadow of doom. The sharp crackle of comms pierced the air, filled with an urgency that mirrored the tension rising in Hayes's chest. The dark silhouettes of the assault ships blotted out the sun, casting long, oppressive shadows across the battlefield. He could taste the metallic tang of anticipation in the back of his throat, the smell of scorched earth mingling with the stinging bite of sweat on his skin. "Here they come," Rojas muttered, his voice a low growl. "A full frontal assault." Hayes's gaze locked onto the advancing ships, their sleek forms slicing through the smoke-filled air. The walkers had regrouped, now flanked by heavily armored ground troops that emerged from the shadows, their exoskeletons gleaming with an eerie, unnatural light. The Empire was mobilizing everything they had left, a final desperate push to crush Earth's resistance. The ground beneath Hayes's boots vibrated with the sheer force of their presence. They were coming, and this time they weren't holding back. "We don't have much time," Hayes said, his voice clipped with urgency. He could feel his heart pounding, a relentless rhythm that matched the impending clash. "Prepare for the worst. They won't stop until we're gone." His eyes scanned the horizon, noting every movement of the Empire's advancing troops, calculating each shift in the formation. The air was thick with the sound of battle, plasma fire hissing through the sky, the deep roar of tanks firing in rapid succession, and the earth-shaking thud of the walkers' heavy legs pounding the ground. The taste of dust lingered on his tongue, sharp and dry, but Hayes's focus remained razor-sharp. "We're outnumbered," Rojas said, a hint of grim realization in his voice. "If we don't break their lines now, we're finished." Hayes's grip tightened around the comms unit, his thoughts moving faster than the world around him. The odds were against them, the numbers stacked in favor of the Empire, but Hayes wasn't about to let fear take hold. He had come too far, seen too much, to back down now. His mind raced, recalling every strategic advantage they'd crafted, every maneuver that had led them to this moment. Earth's fighters weren't just clinging to survival. They were clawing back control, forcing the Empire to play by their rules. "Engage the EMP launchers," Hayes ordered, his voice sharp, cutting through the chaos. "We can't let them get close enough to retaliate. I want their shields down before they can fire." The command was met with a swift response. Soldiers moved with synchronized precision, launching the devices that would disable the Empire's shields and give their tanks a fighting chance. The battle had reached a fever pitch. The once controlled chaos was now an all-out offensive, with Earth's forces throwing everything they had into the fray. The tanks rolled forward, their weapons booming, each shot a calculated risk, each explosion a testament to the mounting pressure. "Target the command walkers," Hayes barked, his voice unwavering. "Cut off the head, and the body will follow." Another round of artillery fired, and a deafening explosion ripped through the air as the first of the massive command walkers crumpled under the weight of their own failure. Hayes could hear the faintest cheer from his troops, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the next assault. This was it, the moment when everything would either break or bend. The Empire's forces surged forward, but Hayes knew the truth. They were beginning to falter. Their arrogance had blinded them. They hadn't expected this fight. They hadn't expected Earth to strike back so fiercely. And as the battle raged on, Hayes felt something shift, an undeniable sense that Earth wasn't just surviving anymore. They were winning. The deafening roar of plasma fire and the thundering crash of falling walkers had filled the air, but for Hayes, everything had gone strangely still. The battlefield, once a maelstrom of fire and chaos, now seemed to be held in a strange, almost fragile silence. The ground was pockmarked with craters, the jagged remains of imperial walkers scattered across the terrain like discarded toys. Smoke rose from their ruined husks, twisting lazily into the sky, but it was the uneasy quiet after the storm that held Hayes' attention. "Is it over?" Rojas's voice broke through the tension, low and cautious. There was no doubt in his tone. He had witnessed what Hayes had seen, the last of the Empire's colossal machines crumpling under their assault. Hayes didn't answer immediately, his gaze sweeping over the battlefield. His senses were heightened, the faint taste of dust on his tongue mingling with the dryness in his throat. His boots sank into the soft earth as he moved, a dull thudding sound marking each step. He could hear the distant crackle of static from the comms, the murmur of the remaining troops checking in, but nothing was quite as loud as the silence that followed the battle. It was a silence filled with the weight of a hard-won victory, yet still fraught with uncertainty. His heart pounded in his chest, but this time it wasn't from the stress of battle. It was the quiet realization that this could be their turning point. "They're retreating," came a voice from the rear, a tremor of disbelief in the tone. It was Major Miller, his eyes scanning the horizon where the last remnants of the Empire's forces had begun to retreat, their ships lifting slowly from the ground, leaving behind their fallen war machines. "Don't get complacent," Hayes replied, his voice cutting through the sudden uneasy calm. "This isn't over yet. They'll regroup. The Empire doesn't give up easily." Even as he spoke, Hayes knew that something had shifted. The Empire's vast war machine, once so confident in its superiority, had faltered. Their massive walkers, their heavily armored ships, all had been humbled by the ingenuity of Earth's resistance. The smell of burned circuits and scorched metal still hung in the air, but there was something almost sweet about it now. Victory had a taste of its own, bitter, hard-earned, but undeniable. "We've won today," Rojas said, his voice quieter now, the weight of the words settling between them. "But what comes next?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Hayes muttered, his eyes still on the retreating ships. His mind raced, but there was a calm to it now, the kind of calm that comes with surviving something bigger than you. He knew the Empire wouldn't be vanquished by a single defeat. They would return, stronger, angrier, more determined. But Earth had proven something in this battle, the resolve to fight, to adapt, to push back against the impossible. The taste of fear that had once gripped their forces now mingled with the taste of defiance. "We prepare," Hayes said, his voice hardening. He turned away from the battlefield, the dust settling around him as his soldiers began to regroup, their movements slower now, but no less determined. "We get ready for whatever comes next." The smoke still lingered in the air, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Hayes allowed himself to breathe. The Empire might return, but today, they had struck a blow that would echo through the galaxy. And the fight was far from over. The victory was still fresh, the air thick with the heat of battle, but Hayes knew that the fight wasn't over. The retreating Imperial forces had left behind a battlefield littered with their machines, the silent wrecks of war telling a story of destruction. Yet Hayes felt a gnawing sensation at the back of his mind, a recognition that the Empire would not simply slink away. The ground beneath his boots had become a heavy reminder of the cost, each step sending a subtle vibration up his legs, the smell of burnt rubber and scorched metal blending into the air like a permanent fixture. "Regroup at the command post," Hayes ordered, his voice calm but insistent. "We need to plan for what comes next." The troops shuffled, the weight of exhaustion etched into their movements. Hayes could hear the low murmur of their voices, the occasional metallic clang of armor and equipment being readjusted, but his mind was far away from the sounds of the moment. The Empire had regrouped once before and could easily do so again. Their retreat was strategic, not a sign of defeat, and Hayes knew better than to think otherwise. The enemy wasn't done. Inside the command post, a few of the senior officers were already gathered, the air in the room thick with the metallic scent of old equipment and papers. Hayes stood before the map, the holographic projection of Earth's defenses flickering in the dim light. Rojas, standing at his side, let out a sigh. "They'll be back, won't they?" "Of course they will," Hayes replied, his eyes scanning the map. "We've given them a bloody nose, but they'll come back with more reinforcements. What they don't realize is that we're not done either." The Empire was relentless, yes, but they were also arrogant. They believed they could crush Earth with sheer force, underestimating the power of strategy, the ability to use their own overconfidence against them. Hayes had studied every move, every retreat, every response from the Empire. The next step was crucial. They had to make the Empire believe they were cornered, make them think they had the upper hand, only to turn that belief into their downfall. "Get me the latest satellite data," Hayes said, his eyes narrowing. The image of the Empire's fleet still hovering in space reminded him of their looming threat. "We're going to make them chase us." The data flickered on the screen, revealing the Empire's position. Massive ships, their shields repaired and their weapons recharged, slowly edging back toward Earth. The same strategy couldn't work twice. They would anticipate it. Hayes could feel the tension rising in the room as he formulated the plan, his fingers moving across the screen with cold precision. "We need to draw them into the northern forests," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the others listen intently. "We'll use the terrain to our advantage. They won't be able to maneuver their walkers or their ships through those trees." "Forest?" Rojas asked, his voice skeptical. "It's a risky move." "The Empire's biggest weakness is their reliance on power and size," Hayes responded, locking eyes with him. "They don't know how to fight in terrain they can't control. That's where we hit them. We draw them in, make them think they're chasing us. They won't see the traps we set." "Understood," Rojas said, nodding. The rest of the officers around him were silent, each processing the strategy in their own way. Hayes turned back to the map, his mind calculating the movements of every soldier, every tank, and every piece of equipment. The next stage was about precision, picking the right moment to strike, knowing when to retreat, when to stand and fight. Every move had to be carefully calculated. The Empire would fall, but it would be by their own hand. "The forest," Hayes muttered to himself, the taste of strategy bitter on his tongue. "They'll never see it coming." The air was thick with anticipation, the tension practically crackling in the command room. Hayes stood over the tactical map, eyes fixed on the blinking red dots representing Imperial forces moving closer, the rumbling of their war machines felt in the pit of his stomach. The sound of boots shuffling across the room, the quiet clatter of weapons being checked, and the hushed whispers of soldiers preparing for what might be their last stand, echoed in the background. It was a strange calm before the storm, a peace that lasted only a heartbeat before the storm would tear everything apart. "They're coming," Rojas said, his voice steady but edged with an undeniable edge of anxiety. "And they're coming hard, full force." Hayes nodded slowly, his mind working furiously. His plan had been set into motion. Earth soldiers had already begun withdrawing into the dense northern forests, pulling the Empire deeper into the trap. Hayes could almost feel the eyes of the enemy on him, waiting for their next move, unaware of the danger lying just ahead. His soldiers were strategically placed in small groups along the ridgelines, hidden amongst the trees, ready to strike. "Focus on the northern ridge," Hayes ordered, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "The walkers won't expect us to be so close, and they won't be able to adjust their formation in time. We hit them fast, hit them hard. We draw them deeper in. Once they're past the choke points, we go for their fuel lines." Rojas glanced at the map, his brow furrowed. "Fuel lines. If we hit those, they'll go down quicker than we anticipate." "Exactly," Hayes replied, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "We don't give them time to retaliate. We make them believe they're in control. Then we take that control away. The forest would be their battlefield, a natural advantage that would force the Empire to fight on Earth's terms." Hayes's heart pounded in his chest, his senses sharpened to the point of pain. The distant crackle of the comms as troops checked in, the faint smell of freshly cut wood from the nearby trees, the deep scent of damp earth beneath his boots. Every detail seemed magnified, heightening the realization of what they were about to face. There was no turning back now. Once we hit their walkers, we need to move fast, Hayes continued, eyes scanning the map, his fingers tracing the edges of the ridges. We've got one shot to take them down. The longer we stay in the open, the more vulnerable we are. Keep moving, stay mobile, don't get caught. A quiet voice from the back of the room broke the silence. What about their air support? Divert them to the eastern field, Hayes replied without hesitation. We've already set up EMP drones there. They won't know what hit them. The troops shifted uneasily, the strategy risky but necessary. Earth's forces had been waiting for this moment, prepared to strike at the Empire's greatest weakness, complacency. The Empire had underestimated them before, but they weren't about to make that mistake again. Hayes could feel his stomach twist as he thought about the soldiers who had already fallen, their sacrifice now guiding every move, every decision. The sounds outside began to grow louder. The tremors of Imperial walkers marching toward the trap could be felt through the ground, vibrating up through the soles of his boots. Hayes straightened, glancing at the team gathered around him, their faces set with resolve. Move out, he ordered. We fight now, for Earth, for every one of us. The soldiers moved quickly, the sharp crunch of boots on gravel accompanying them as they retreated into the forests. The plan was set. There was no room for error. They were going to strike hard, and they were going to win. Part 15. Collapse of the Empire. The forest was alive with the crackling energy of war. Every tree, every broken piece of land told the story of what had been fought for, of what was yet to come. Hayes moved with purpose, his boots sinking into the moist earth beneath him as the weight of the coming battle hung in the air like a storm cloud. The Empire had drawn closer, their massive walkers forcing their way through the dense trees, leaving destruction in their wake. But Earth was ready. Hayes could feel the electric pulse of his soldiers around him, sharp, focused, relentless in their silence. How much longer? Rojas's voice cut through the stillness, his tone barely a whisper but laced with tension. He was standing beside Hayes, eyes scanning the movement of the enemy, his knuckles white against his weapon. We're in position, Hayes said, his voice cold but filled with certainty. Hold your fire until I say. The Empire's forces advanced, oblivious to the snare tightening around them. The walkers had become bolder, less cautious, their enormous frames swaying with the heavy thuds of their progress. Hayes could feel the distant vibrations beneath his feet. Closer, closer, each step they took pushing them deeper into the trap. The smell of damp soil filled Hayes's nose, mixing with the sharp, bitter taste of anticipation on his tongue. The tension was unbearable. Every nerve in his body was alert, every fiber of his being straining for the signal. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a shadowy twilight, the sky darkening as if the heavens themselves understood the gravity of what was happening. The weight of it all was almost too much. They're here, Hayes muttered, his eyes narrowing as the first walker lumbered into the open space ahead. The trees groaned under its weight, the air charged with the looming violence. His heartbeat seemed to slow, every second stretching longer than the last. Now! Fire! The world exploded. A barrage of fire tore through the air, the blast of cannon fire mixing with the booming crash of explosions. Earth's tanks, hidden in the foliage, unleashed their fury. The Empire's walkers faltered, the first one struck at its joints, collapsing under the weight of its own failure. Hayes saw the fear flash across the faces of the Imperial soldiers as their machines fell like trees, each explosion sending shockwaves through the ground. "Target their fuel lines," Hayes shouted, his words crisp, urgent. "Make sure they can't retreat." The fire continued, precise, calculated. Earth's forces were relentless in their execution, striking with the fury of a cornered animal. The Empire had underestimated them, believing that their sheer might would break Earth's will. Now the tables had turned. The smell of burning metal mixed with the scent of victory as the Empire's once mighty war machines crumbled beneath their feet. Rojas looked at Hayes, his face grim but filled with a spark of something akin to awe. "Is this it? Are we really doing this?" Hayes didn't answer immediately, his eyes locked onto the destruction unfolding before him. The ground was littered with the wreckage of imperial machines, their once imposing forms reduced to nothing more than twisted metal and smoldering wreckage. The fight wasn't over, but the Empire's confidence had shattered. The realization settled in like a heavy weight. Earth was standing tall. Earth was not just surviving, it was conquering. "We're not done yet," Hayes said, his voice unwavering even as the battle raged around him. "But they'll never forget what we've shown them." The final walker collapsed, its massive frame tumbling to the ground with an earth-shaking crash. The remaining Imperial forces turned, retreating, but it was too late. Earth soldiers moved in, their weapons primed, their morale unbreakable. Hayes watched as the enemy scattered, the fear evident in their hasty retreat. The tide had finally turned. As the last remnants of the Empire's fleet disappeared into the distance, Hayes stood tall, feeling the weight of the victory settle over him like a cloak. Earth had shown its strength, its resilience. They had faced an empire that thought itself invincible, and they had proved them wrong. "We've won," Rojas said, voice thick with disbelief. "We've really done it." Hayes looked at the horizon, his eyes filled with a quiet satisfaction. We've made them fear us." In the silence that followed, Earth's warriors stood victorious, knowing that this fight wasn't just about survival. It was about showing the universe what humanity was capable of when pushed to its limits. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The smoke still curled from the wreckage of the last walker, its massive form reduced to nothing more than twisted metal and scorched earth. Hayes stood amidst the destruction, his breath steady but his mind racing, as the cries of Earth's soldiers echoed through the clearing. The battle had been won, but the war, the true war, was only beginning. The Empire had retreated, broken, but Hayes could already sense the inevitable return of their fury. They would regroup, they would retaliate, but they wouldn't forget. Humanity had given them a lesson they would never erase. Rojas approached, his face smudged with dirt and his armor battered but intact. He stopped next to Hayes, staring at the remnants of the battlefield. "What now?" His voice held a note of disbelief, as though he couldn't quite grasp the full weight of their victory. Hayes looked out over the horizon, the sky now painted with the colors of dawn. The world had been altered forever, not just by the destruction that had come, but by the strength that Earth had shown in the face of an impossible threat. "Now we prepare," Hayes said, his voice low, filled with the weight of a future that had to be fought for. "We didn't just survive this. We made them fear us." The realization hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Earth had proven itself. The Empire, for all its might, had underestimated humanity's will to fight, to adapt, to evolve when pushed beyond its limits. The soldiers that stood around Hayes weren't just survivors. They were the embodiment of Earth's unyielding resolve. The taste of victory wasn't sweet. It was bitter, hard-won, earned in the fire of battle, but it was theirs. "Fear doesn't mean they'll stop," Rojas said, his tone somber but understanding. "We've shown them we're not a soft target, but they'll come back." Hayes nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Let them. We'll be ready. And this time, we'll make sure they know what we're capable of." The silence that followed wasn't one of defeat, but of quiet strength. It was the calm that followed the storm, the collective exhale of a people who had proven their worth. Earth had stood tall in the face of overwhelming odds and had triumphed. The Empire might have thought they could crush them. They might have thought Earth was just another footnote in the galaxy's history, but now the universe would remember humanity's name. "Tell the others," Hayes said, his voice steady and firm. "This isn't over, but we've made our mark, and they'll never forget it." As the soldiers began to regroup, preparing for whatever came next, Hayes felt the weight of the title they had earned. Not just survivors, but the unstoppable force that the galaxy would learn to fear. They had fought with everything they had. They had proven that no matter how strong the enemy, no matter how dire the odds, humanity would always rise to the challenge. They were Earth's legacy, and they would not be forgotten. The stars overhead seemed brighter now, as if the universe itself had taken notice. And Hayes, standing among the ruins of the Empire's machines, knew that the Earth he had fought for was stronger than it had ever been. They had not just survived. They had conquered.